In this talk, I'll explain the logic or model of development in Singapore. To make it clear, I'll provide a brief summary of the talk. This talk uses the case of Singapore to argue that the theory of open access order, advocated by North and his co-authors, provides one possible option only. Although their theory of open access order explains the West to some extent, it does not always apply to the contemporary non-Western countries. Similar to the case of India and Japan that I have examined elsewhere, the case of Singapore shows that what is more important to economic and human development is the open access in the economic sphere and interconnected institutions in the area of property rights protection and contract enforcement, financial market, rule of law, and human resource accumulation. In other words, countries without open access in the political sphere, as practiced in Singapore, may also be able to achieve a great deal of success in terms of economic and human development if they ensure open access in the economic sphere and devote adequate resources to establish the necessary interconnected institutions. I call these necessary interconnected institutions because they need to support the open access order. And they're also mutually related to each other to some extent. With this brief summary, let me begin with the talk. The concept, North and his co-authors, in their book entitled Violence and Social Orders, divide countries and regions into open access orders and natural states. Open access orders refer to countries and regions which have open access both to political organizations and activities and to economic organizations and activities. Natural states means countries or regions which impose heavy restrictions either in the political sphere or the economic sphere. There's a logic behind their open access orders. The open access order in the political sphere makes it difficult for the government or any faction to manipulate the open access order in the economy. Similarly, open access order to economic organizations and activities requires political organizations to consider the broad interest of society in order to gain political power to run a government. And so open access in the political sphere and the economic sphere may be mutually related. And if they work in the right directions, then nations and regions may move along the line of a virtuous cycle. Otherwise, when nations, regions are in the natural state, they are more likely to be in the vicious cycle. And the question raised by me is this: whether contemporary non-Western countries should adopt the Western model of democracy. The Western model of democracy has two important elements. One is inclusiveness through popular or universal elections. The other element is contestation or a multi-party systems to run a government through multi-party competition. Now, if no, then what is the possible alternatives? Okay, that's the major task of this talk. So this talk makes an argument that the logic underlying the open access orders is not the only way of economic and human development in the contemporary non-Western world. Yeah. North and his co-authors tried to downplay the importance of inclusiveness through popular or universal elections. Their conclusion or observation is based on the evidence that among the 150 democracies around the world, there are only around 30 nations, regions which are relatively wealthy. So what they try to do is to emphasize the importance of open access in the political spheres. The nations should make it easy for people to establish political organizations to carry out economic political activities. With open access in the political spheres, then it also makes difficult for people, the government, any fraction within a particular nation to manipulate the economic sphere or to monopolize economic resources. Now, what I try to do in the talk is also to go a step further. If it's possible to challenge one of the elements of Western democracy, the inclusiveness element, with the form of popular or universal elections, and it is also possible to downplay the importance of contestation through a multi-party system. So this talk makes this argument. Okay? Elsewhere, I have used the case of India to show that it is mainly the open access in the economic sphere and the development of interconnected institutions that have generated considerable economic growth since the beginning of the 1980s, or particularly the 1990s. Evidence from Japan is to the same effect, that it is open access in the economic sphere and institutional buildings related to the so-called interconnected institutions supporting the open access in the economic sphere that determines economic and human development. So I come to the case of Singapore. So talk goes a step further to argue that the successful economic and human development in Singapore provides strong evidence that a country or region is able to develop well if there's open access in the economic sphere and there are interconnected institutions to support the open access in the economic sphere. In other words, open access in the political sphere is not a necessary condition for economic and human development. More likely, contestation or a multi-party system element in the West is a consequence or outcome of a complicated process among political, economic, social, or legal factors. Yeah? They may be relevant. Western democracy may be relevant to economic and human development, but if that is the case, it's more likely to be indirect through the shaping of institutions, like the concept that the government should consider the interest of the widest population possible when they build institutions, when they adopt public policies. I'll provide a very brief kind of summary of the evidence showing the successful development of performance in Singapore. And the body of literature is very large, and nowadays it's very easy to obtain information through the internet. From 1960 to 1991, the average annual GDP growth rate in Singapore was around 8% and remained very high thereafter. GDP per capita increased from $2,000 in 1960 to 25,000 in 1995 and to above $50,000 recently. If people think that the development should not be measured entirely by GDP or the production of commodities, then we may also provide evidence related to the development of human beings. Okay? Here are some of the indicators. Infant mortality rate in Singapore decreased significantly since the beginning of the 1960s. The People's Action Party assumed power since 1959. Life expectancy rate improved enormously, and education enhanced considerably. Behind the success stories, we need to understand the importance of open access in the economy. Okay? This is based on the insight of Olsen that to achieve economic success, the government and nation must pay attention to the interest of the widest population possible. Open access in the economic sphere is to a large extent related to that objective. Singapore has done enormously in this area from the beginning of the 1960s. Free trade along the traditional line, active encouragement of foreign direct investment into the economy, and targeted development of specific economic sectors through government-linked corporations are all intended to expand the economic production frontier of Singapore. Yeah. They're all related to the open access in the economic sphere logic. Open access in the economic sphere, however, does not go by itself without the necessary institutions. So these institutions include rule of law, supporting contract enforcement and property rights protections. If you pay attention to various rule of law rankings, Singapore has always been on top. These interconnected institutions also include the financial market. The body of economic literature recently indicates that in order to develop the financial market, it's awfully important to protect the rights of investors or to protect the rights of creditors. Legal protection of capital supplies is very important to development of the financial market. And if you follow the line of Ross Levinas and others, financial development is able to promote economic development. Yeah. Also related is the educational sectors. Singapore, according to various kinds of international test results of primary school or secondary school students, various types of rankings of universities, is always, okay, Singapore is always on top of these various rankings. Despite the fact that Singapore has open access in the economic spheres and has constructed various necessary interconnected institutions to support open access in the economic sphere, in the political sphere, the story is very different. Singapore, in other words, Singapore doesn't follow the Western type of models very closely. Okay? Although Singapore has retained the principles of popular election, majority rule, and public accountability through parliamentary systems, it has resisted a truly Western political system of competitive democracy. In other words, Singapore has imposed various non-trivial restrictions to the open access in the political sphere. These restrictions have been adopted through various means of deliberately weakening different opposition groups, including opposition parties, civil societies, trade unions, students' organizations, newspapers and mediums, etc. According to some political scientists, Singapore is an authoritarian type of regime. Okay? And the question to be raised is, if nations and regions following the Western line of democracy are not able to perform very well in terms of economic development, in terms of human flourishing, then why Singapore is not a good example? So that brings me to the end of this talk. Thank you for your patience.